Oh, this is Martin Clarkson, Communication Studies Professor at Colorado State University and the Director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. This is the third of a set of three introductory videos around the framework of wicked problems, wide cities, basically an introduction to kind of wicked problems lens and deliberative engagement. So the first video has a broader kind of introduction. I'll put a link to it in the comments. But this video starts now digging into kind of the good news of deliberative engagement and some of the kind of more tangible kind of tools. So I am going to share my screen and pull out my PowerPoint. So the first video did an overall introduction, then dug into the concept of wicked problems as we use it here at the CPD. The second one dug into the bad news of social psychology and brain science, really explaining why, unfortunately, we're not wired for deliberation or collaboration. We're much more wired for outrage and for polarization and kind of for simple narratives. And unfortunately, a lot of the processes and institutions, feed into that and bring out the worst of human nature. And then on top of that, there's conflict entrepreneurs that are taking advantage of human nature and feeding us these simple narratives. But this last video is the hopeful video. It's that recognition of once we see the world through the wicked problems lens and kind of understand that our toughest problems really involve competing underlying values that we need to dig into, and we know how our brains work and how our institutions don't, we can start making the kind of changes, the individual changes, the organizational changes, hopefully community changes, at least at the local level, that start kind of building capacity to give us the kind of conversations we need to have, right? This is going to be kind of an overview of these tools. I'll do some additional videos, supplemental videos that will really dig into some of the specific tools on here. So again, on the resource page, that's linked in the comments, you'll see a lot more information. And then as I develop some additional videos, I'll spark it there. You'll also get a chance to kind of give me your name. So then as I add new information, you'll get an email, right? But this last video is kind of structured in terms of building capacity, these kind of key steps for local communities to do to build a capacity to address wicked problems better. And these are organized in the short term to long term. So the first one, and this one, if you buy my argument for the next 20 minutes or so, you've accomplished the first step, which is at least the ability to adopt what I call a wicked problems mindset. And this is particularly important for community leaders as we kind of go through, so that you'll see the connection to kind of leadership here. So some basic aspects of the wicked problems mindset, which really build off somewhat in the first video, is to presume wicked problems, not wicked people. Now, I'm not saying here that there's not wicked people. Clearly, there are in lots of different ways. I am saying a few different things. One is I'm saying there's not nearly as many wicked people as we think. Our brain wants to go there. That's the simple narrative that our brain wants. But even more importantly, or pragmatically, there's very few people that would self-identify as wicked. And we certainly know from the research that telling someone that you think they're wicked is very unlikely to make them less wicked. Right? So broadly, when I do this work of wicked problems, when we do the work of the CPD, there's kind of at least two big categories, or maybe a spectrum of kind of issues. Some are just true wicked problems. They're just complex issues that lots of reasonable people on different sides that focus on different values and prioritize them differently. And certainly, wicked problems analysis is a good tool to help us kind of deal with those issues. Then there's some other issues that perhaps the research is pretty clear what side is right? That the data is there, that is kind of unbalanced in a sense. But there's still that's where the pragmatic value of wicked problems analysis and deliberative engagement still kind of work, right? Because if you're so sure you're right and the other side's wrong, but you're polarized, attacking the other side, throwing facts at them, those things don't work, right? The polarization kind of undermines the conversation that we need to have. So one power of deliberative engagement is you elevate the quality of information. You avoid triggering the worst of human nature. You rehumanize people. You depolarize it, and then all of a sudden, so if it is truly clear that one side, all the evidence lies on one side, or the best arguments lie on one side, deliberative engagement is going to make that clear. If some of the key issues that we're dealing with are truly bad faith actors that are controlling things and oppressing people, I think they love the fact that we're all screaming at each other and facts don't matter. Right? So again, the pragmatic nature of this work is as we elevate our conversations, facts matter more, arguments matter more, good reasons matter more, and that's when I think we're going to be able to move the needle on some tough issues. Second, become more comfortable with uncertainty. Right? Our brain is wired for simplicity. We want consistency. And we're not saying kind of go the opposite extreme in a sense, right? But move towards being more comfortable with uncertainty. It's an important leadership trait that unfortunately we don't inherently kind of have in some part ways. So this gets at that leadership kind of notion. Traditional leadership, you have a strong opinion, you have charisma, you can rally the troops, you can get people fired up. Still an important part of leadership in certain situations, certainly crisis situations. But with wicked problems, it often doesn't work so well or even backfires. So this notion of facilitated leadership that's developing now, I truly believe the superpower of leaders in the 21st century is going to be the ability to bring people together across perspectives to address kind of shared problems. So it's a different skill set that we need to develop. Right? The reality is, unfortunately, our elections tend to elect traditional leaders because they can fire up that side and then get people to polls. But once in office, we need them to be facilitative leaders. And for too many, that's too much of a stretch. At a local level, it's a little bit easier. We do often kind of elect local facilitated leaders because at the local level, we need leaders that get things done, right? They can't just play political games and get reelected and reelected. But that, we need our leaders to have both skills. I think they naturally have the skills, the traditional skills. We need to find better ways of developing the facilitated skills so they have them when those are needed. Third, focus on elevating the conversation, not just winning the argument. This is an important aspect of my facilitators. But as I kept on doing this work, I realized how much we need more people in the community that as they walk into a public meeting, as they walk into a process, instead of being there to convince people they're right, instead of being there to kind of sell their particular perspective, if at least part of them, not 100% of them, at least a significant part of them is focused on helping us have a better conversation, that's what we're trying to kind of move forward to, right? And when you have more and more people in your community that their goal is to elevate the conversation, that's when you're really going to move the needle on these issues in some important ways. Right? Fourth, put your energy towards identifying, engaging, and negotiating their intentions. I talked a lot about that in the first video, right? The heart of wicked problems is the issues that we're dealing with inherently involve tensions. We need to kind of struggle with those. So retrain your brain to start looking for those tensions, to identify those, put them on the table, and build capacity for people to work through those tensions in productive ways. And the last aspect of wicked problems mindset is you're working towards creating a learning community. Going back to wicked problems, there's no solutions. There's no technical kind of solutions that you employ and the problem goes away. Inherently, you have to have this ongoing conversation to take on the wicked problem. So to what degree are we building capacity in our organizations and our communities to have quality ongoing conversations? We know how to do this now from lots of different fields, as you'll see examples here in a few minutes. How do we build capacity to make sure we're doing that in our communities? The second kind of big step is to start changing our processes. I showed in the second video how too many of the basic processes we use to engage people on tough issues, unfortunately, bring out the worst of human nature. So how can we start making tweaks on how we're doing processes so we get more out of it, right? So earlier I shared the bad news from the social psychology of brain science in the second video. These are the negative aspects of human nature that kind of come out to us too strong. But the good news is that there is good news there. There is things that we kind of tap into in a much more positive way, right? So some of the good news is this is kind of the other side of the coin that I talked about in terms of us being groupish. We are inherently social. We seek purpose and community. We have a lot of common ground of what we want as people, as humans. So how do you tap into that? There's some positive aspects of that you can kind of tap into, particularly in a local community, right? Second, we are inherently empathetic. It's a basic aspect of human nature, triggered in certain ways. Unfortunately, it is more natural to be empathetic to people that look like you. So there's some barriers there, some concerns that we're working on. But it is something that is triggered from listening to each other's stories, seeing each other's facial expression, seeing each other's emotions. So bringing people together in positive ways and letting them engage each other. You're possibly surprised sometimes as people kind of recognize this. And that builds on that power of us versus the power of the us and them, right? Third, we're inherently pragmatic and creative. This is probably the defining feature in some ways of human nature that we need to kind of dig into a little bit more, right? what makes us humans is, new research now in imagination that only, of all the species, humans are really the only ones that can kind of imagine a future and create a new future. We're wonderful creative problem solvers when asked to be. The sad thing is how infrequently we're asked to be in our politics, right? So how do we use process design to tap into that? And this is really the heart of Wicked Problems, to go back to that notion of, instead of making the easy assumption that problems are caused by wicked people or bad people with bad values, you put the wickedness in the problem. All of a sudden, instead of being face to face with your opponent, you're now shoulder to shoulder with a collaborator. The problem's on the table, and you're giving people a group project. You're tapping into the us versus them. You're tapping into creativity. And that's the fascinating thing about some of these events. Instead of just collecting individual opinions of people talking past each other, you're sparking learning. You're sparking creativity. You're asking people, instead of just to be a taxpayer or be a consumer or be an advocate, you're asking them to be collaborative problem solvers. And all of a sudden, those public events give you new ideas and give you passionate people excited about implementing those in some important ways. And then fourth, while I do say, the negative aspects are stronger than the positive aspects that are easier to trigger, unfortunately, they're not determinate. Right. Our brain can learn. We can kind of make new connections in a sense. So the more that we do this work, the easier it is to do. We can overcome those bad tendencies. A lot of the negative social psychology, I really believe there's like an inoculation effect. The more you know about how your brain wants to think simple, the easier it is sometimes to change that, to control that, and to avoid that. Right. So that's where we want to kind of build up, and you'll see how I end this video with this kind of positive feedback loop that we're seeing when we do authentic engagement. Right. Earlier in the second video, I kind of shared kind of the bad news that facts, unfortunately, aren't going to save us. Right. When we're polarized, when we're in an adversarial kind of environment, facts don't work, and too often they even kind of backfire. But what does change minds is people having a genuine conversation with someone that they've built some connection with. So again, particularly in our local communities, how do we provide these opportunities for people that think differently, that prioritize values in different ways, to come together and have a more productive conversation? Because not only are they going to undo the polarization, they're also potentially going to come up with better ideas. In research on innovation, I'll share this in the resource guide. Shows that some of the best ideas, it's not the single kind of brilliant person having the eureka moment coming out. Great ideas come from people that think differently coming together and combining and coming up with something new. Right? And that can be a kind of a basic aspect of your public engagement. So in a way of summary, in a sense, the work that we do, we try to have these four big shifts, from the easy assumption of wicked people to the more nuanced assumption of the wickedness is in the problem. That's moving from an adversarial model to a much more collaborative model of what you're asking people to do. We know when we do that, when we're in adversarial mode, we're bringing out the worst of human nature. When we're in collaborative mode, we really have the potential to bring out the best of human nature. And for those of you who are really kind of data-driven, who are experts that want kind of the hard information, unfortunately, when we're in adversarial mode, facts don't work. Right? We either dismiss them if we disagree with them, or we might kind of throw them at each other if we agree with them. But when we're in collaborative mode, we want good information, right? We want that, information can't make the decisions for us, but can certainly help us have better conversations and come up with better ideas based on that. And it brings those worlds together better. So now the third step is kind of building more local capacity. So there's a whole kind of field, the work I do, I use the term deliberative engagement. There's a lot of different kind of concepts for it, kind of cutting across multiple disciplines in higher ed, but then also different kind of practitioner worlds. The basic kind of common ground across all of these is this notion that that we need facilitators, we need process people. These kind of conversations are not natural. Our brains aren't wired for them. So you need people that know what they're doing to help kind of design these processes and kind of shepherd and facilitate them as you're kind of going through. Right? So this slide is really kind of some of the nuts and bolts. I'll have additional videos that I'll kind of play off some of these kind of specific bullet points to give more nuts and bolts. But these are kind of some of the key components, the design elements of deliberation that are kind of critical to sparking a very different kind of engagement, a very different kind of conversation. So one that I've already talked about essentially is you're framing it in different ways. You're framing it as a wicked problem. You want multiple approaches. You don't want a yes, no to one specific policy. You want people people to kind of think broadly. You want to have a broad range of actors. It's not just looking at government as solving problems. Communities cutting across nonprofit and private and new organizations and individual action. We try as much as possible to start these discussions upstream. What that means is let's engage the public in helping us define and understand the problem and start coming up with solutions instead of waiting until you have one specific solution that you're asking people to kind of react to, which is likely to not spark a very positive conversation. Right? Second key aspect is in almost all of our processes, we have some sort of discussion guide or backgrounder. This for sure, I'll have a separate video that I'll kind of summarize and provide some examples of it. But a lot of my work, as I said in the first video, is making sense of the noise, right? I'm engaging the broader public discourse, the one at a time on the microphone, the emails to city council, the comments on a message board. We have all these ways of people expressing individual opinion. My job is to try to make sense of all that and then repackage it in a way that people see their voice in there, see their perspectives, but it's framed to spark a different conversation. This notion of a document created to spark deliberation, not persuasion, is important. It's an art that we need. We need this tool in all our communities, right? And these backgrounders are special. Again, I can't get too much into it kind of in this shorter video. But again, they're designed to tap into human nature in a different way. They're providing a base of information, something to react to. We also often kind of frame them as, we didn't get it perfect. We want people to tell us what they like, what they don't like, what's missing in these documents. But just that aspect of it, we're giving them a group project. And it redirects the attention. Instead of them having to focus on each other, they're working together on a round table on this document and improving this document. And it gives, it elevates the conversation in some critical ways. Deliberation is about small groups, right? You see the picture on the bottom from one of our events. Now, this requires significant capacity, right? Obviously, I've got 30 trained facilitators with the students that are getting class credit, right? But there's other ways of developing kind of a facilitator core that's critical. But when you have 100 people and you're just doing one time on the microphone, the people that go to the microphone are those often with the biggest blinders on. And you're just collecting individual opinions, often problematic opinions. Whereas in a small group with a facilitator, right, you have a very different conversation. You're hearing from more people, right? People are much more willing to be open-minded and to dig into the nuance in some important ways, right? And then processes that are designed for interaction and learning. The type of questions we're asked, the kind of things that we're getting them to react to, the discussion guides that we're creating, those are all, we're not just gathering public input, right? We're not gathering individual opinions. We're working to refine those opinions. We're working to tap into creativity. So there's a whole kind of so many resources out there. There's just one that I'll have linked on the resource page from NCDD, the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation, a great document that has links to lots of different kind of processes. They organize their processes in 4 streams of what you're trying to do. Are you exploring a new issue? Are you trying to transform a conflict? Are you trying to make a decision? Are you trying to spark community action? Right? So this is just one of the tools out there, but there's just lots of different processes out there. Some of them short, some of them all days, some of them several days, some of them online, many of them face-to-face. That are all kind of specifically designed to help us engage complex issues much more productively. There'll be a separate video on this. I just want to show it kind of briefly. This is one of the basic kind of tools we use a lot. Sam Kainer's work on the diamond of participatory decision-making. Very useful tool. The really quick introduction to this is any kind of process is going to have these 3 stages that we have to go through. The first stage of divergent thinking, of getting lots of different opinions and getting out there, which you can do by a survey, which you can do at one time on the microphone. That's the making sense of the noise. But then at some point, you have so many different opinions, you have to have a different process to work through the growth zone. Right. And that's where I think you need the small groups. You need kind of more facilitated for us to have those tough conversations, not just talking past each other. But then on the back end, at some point, you can't talk forever. So you need convergent thinking. You need to make some tough choices. You need to prioritize. You need to kind of move to action. So each of those is 3 different kind of communication styles, 3 different kind of toolkits that you're kind of tapping into. And we often don't have all 3 in our communities. So that's some of the new work I'm doing that really kind of looks at how do you kind of do environmental scan in your community. Think about the resources you have, both potentially within city government, but also within civil society, to have the ability to go through each of these stages to get to the point that you have a good decision, a sustainable decision, a decision that's seen as legitimate, and that moves the needle on tough issues. Right? And the last key component is deliberative facilitators. Right? So you have someone at the table who understands human nature, that understands the social psychology, that understands the issue, that's trained in conflict management, trained in deliberative engagement to help people walk through that. And this becomes one of the kind of big key capacity resources that we're having to rethink on how do we develop this in our community. Some of that's partnerships with higher ed. Some of that might be partnership with volunteer communities. Some of that might be having the funding to hire professional facilitators. Some of that might be building up a facilitator corps within city government or school districts. Lots of different kind of options there. But I think having someone at the table whose job is to help people have these conversations it becomes critical. Right. So the last two steps are pretty quick. So one is this broader kind of longer term thing of how do we kind of reinvigorate our community. Robert Putnam's work in Bowling Alone talks about the importance of social capital. He makes a distinction between bonding social capital and bridging social capital. So bonding social capital brings like-minded people together, and bridging social capital brings people across perspectives together. His thesis and the thesis of other political scientists is, over the last, half century, we've lost a lot of our bridging capital, right? Especially locally. Most organizations, the internet's really good at bonding and bringing people, like-minded people together. There's national organizations too. So instead of people having a local organization, they're meeting people that think differently. They're writing checks to national organizations, and that kind of undermines our capacity in a lot of different ways. So this kind of slide kind of shows from more polarizing or bonding organizations to more bridging. And what's happened in the last 10, 20 years now as we polarized, those on the top now are kind of hyper polarizing. Those in the middle, which for many people used to be seen as independent, as nonpartisan, now are seen more and more as partisan and getting swallowed up by the polarization, which is dangerous. And then those organizations on the bottom, this is again the thesis that these are the ones that have kind of died off in a way. So a lot of my work long-term with community is we have to change this. We have to work with the middle group to rebuild their kind of impartiality, to rebuild the trust that people have in them so they can kind of play their role in community. And then we have to create new or reinvigorate old bridging institutions. The importance of these mediating or bridging institutions that are designed to bring people together across perspectives are huge. You need to identify those resources in your community and really nurture them and help them get sustained and help them grow in some important ways. And I've got a couple of writings about that I'll share in the resource guide. And then the last point, cultivate citizens as wise collaborators, is the longer term of how do we rethink civic education? How do we change what we think about the role of citizens, the role of the public in these conversations? Right now, they often, again, see themselves either as taxpayers or consumers or advocates or activists. I think civic education needs to kind of reframe itself. So I've got an article I'll share that people, if they're interested in that idea in particular, dig. So I came up with the term wise collaborators as this new ideal that we should be training, starting in elementary school, educating kids about the social psychology, about how we want to see simple, and giving them the tools to engage tensions and giving them tools to spark very different conversations so that the next generation are walking into public meetings deliberation ready. And much less likely to fall into the negative aspects of human nature. So I'll end this. This is part of the second video of the bad news, the negative feedback loop that we get that increases kind of polarization. Again, I made the argument that it's exaggerated polarization. It's not nearly as bad as we think, but it kind of goes through this vicious cycle, negative feedback loop. Well, and with the opposite, the virtuous cycle of authentic engagement. That we know from experience from people like me and other communities that are doing this work, that the more you give people an opportunity for authentic engagement, to really have these conversations and engage issues in deeper ways, you develop some mutual understanding. Maybe not agreement, right? But certainly mutual understanding. In one way, it's clarifying the conflict. Let's get away from this assumed conflict, which is exaggerated, and get the actual conflict where we disagree, which is always going to be much more manageable. And then we start building trust and respect, rebuild the trust in our institutions, which are critical to civil society, and rebuild at least some trust in each other, address that effective polarization in particular. And once we do that, then all of a sudden, public engagement coming together becomes a process of refining our opinions, of learning from each other, not just talking past each other, not just collecting a whole bunch of individual opinions, but working together on an issue, activating people as creative problem solvers. And then that leads and builds up in your community that the potential for collaboration and co-creation, which is so critical for the ability of communities to address their wicked problems well. And as you see from this is a virtual cycle. The more you do this, the easier it is to do. You build up the skills, you build up the perspectives, you build up the relationships to do this work. Right? So with that, again, there's the link to the resource page that'll develop for this. There's my email. You can also follow me on Twitter or on Facebook. I have the Wicked Problems Mindset is a Facebook blog that I keep. But hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation. As I mentioned, I'll be developing additional videos for some specific concepts that I've spoken here. Some of those might be developed by request. So be happy to feel free to email me and ask me questions as we engage in this discussion. Thank you.